The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Montana wilderness, blanketing the small cabin where Thomas Harwood had lived alone for the past 7 years. Since the accident that took his wife Marie and their daughter Emily, Thomas had retreated from civilization, finding solace in the solitude of the forest where he worked as a ranger for the U.S. Forest Service. That particular December night was brutal even by Montana standards. The temperature had plummeted to 20 below, and the wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal. Thomas sat by his wood stove, carving a small owl from a piece of pine, a hobby that helped quiet his mind during the long winter evenings. The sound was so faint that at first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, a soft scratching at his door, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Thomas set down his carving knife and approached the door cautiously. Living this far from civilization meant that unexpected visitors were rarely welcome ones. When he opened the door, the blast of cold air hit him like a physical blow. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then his eyes lowered to the porch, where a dog lay huddled against the bitter cold. It was a large animal, likely a husky mix, its once thick coat matted with ice and dirt. The dog didn't even have the strength to lift its head when the door opened. Thomas hesitated. He had deliberately avoided attachment since the accident, even to animals. His last dog, a retriever named Cooper, had died 2 years ago, and Thomas had vowed not to replace him. The pain of loss was still too raw, too familiar. But something in the animal's resigned posture, the quiet dignity with which it faced death, struck a chord in Thomas. With a sigh that created a cloud of vapor in the frigid air, he bent down and carefully lifted the dog. It was disturbingly light, clearly starving, and its body trembled uncontrollably. Inside the cabin, Thomas set the dog down on a blanket near the stove. The animal's blue eyes, startlingly bright against its dirty coat, followed his movements warily. Thomas heated some broth he had made from yesterday's rabbit and offered it in a shallow bowl. The dog didn't move at first, as if conserving its meager energy. Then, slowly, it began to lap at the warm liquid. That night, Thomas slept on the couch instead of his bed, keeping watch over his unexpected guest. Several times he woke to check on the dog, whose breathing seemed dangerously shallow. By morning, though, the animal's condition had stabilized, though it remained weak and listless. Days passed, and the dog gradually regained strength. Thomas discovered it was female and began calling her Luna because of the perfect white crescent marking on her chest, visible once he'd cleaned her matted fur. There was no collar, no sign of ownership. Given their remote location and the severe winter conditions, Thomas guessed Luna had been lost for weeks, perhaps abandoned by hikers or hunters when she became injured. A healing wound on her hind leg supported this theory. The first time Luna wagged her tail, a weak, hesitant gesture a week after her arrival, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It was like a frozen river beginning to thaw, cracking and groaning as the ice gave way to flowing water. He found himself talking to Luna, first in short, practical sentences, then in longer reflections as he went about his daily routines. Winter deepened. Thomas and Luna settled into a rhythm. She would accompany him on his shorter patrols, gaining strength with each passing day. At night, she slept near the stove, occasionally whimpering in her dreams, perhaps reliving whatever ordeal had brought her to Thomas's doorstep. In late January, during a brief break in the weather, Thomas decided to venture to the nearest town, Pinewood Springs, for supplies. Luna, now healthy and robust, insisted on coming along, jumping into his truck before he could stop her. It was a 15-mile drive on treacherous roads, but Thomas welcomed the company. Pinewood Springs was a small community of just over 2,000 souls. Thomas typically visited only when necessary, exchanging minimal pleasantries with the locals. This time, however, as he parked outside the general store, he noticed a bulletin board covered with flyers. One caught his eye, a missing dog poster with a photo that made his heart sink. There was Luna, identified as Alaska, belonging to the Parker family. Inside the store, the owner, Bill Matthews, greeted Thomas with surprise. "Thomas, twice in 1 month? Must be some kind of record." Thomas frowned. "I haven't been in since before Christmas." Bill's expression changed to confusion. "But that Parker girl said—" "Well, speak of the devil." A young woman had entered the store, stomping snow from her boots. When she looked up, her eyes widened at the sight of Thomas. "Mr. Harwood?" she asked hesitantly. Thomas didn't recognize her, yet she clearly knew him. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and Luna, or Alaska, bounded in. The joyful reunion that followed confirmed what Thomas already knew. He'd been harboring someone else's beloved pet. What Thomas couldn't understand was how the young woman, Rebecca Parker, knew his name. The explanation, when it came, was more surprising than he could have imagined. Rebecca Parker was a wildlife photographer who had been tracking a wolf pack in the national forest when she became disoriented in a sudden snowstorm 3 weeks ago. Alaska, her loyal companion, had gone for help when Rebecca injured her ankle. The dog never returned, and Rebecca had been rescued the following day by another hiker who heard her calls. But here was the truly extraordinary part. According to Rebecca, someone matching Thomas's description had guided the hiker to her location. A man with a gray beard and a Forest Service jacket, accompanied by a dog. The man had disappeared before Rebecca could thank him, but the hiker had mentioned the name patch on his jacket. Harwood. Thomas had no memory of this. He had been nowhere near that part of the forest during the snowstorm. Yet the hiker's description matched him perfectly, down to the scar above his right eyebrow. The story spread quickly through Pinewood Springs. Some spoke of mountain spirits or guardian angels. Others suggested more rational explanations, perhaps another ranger with a similar appearance, or simply a case of confused memories during a traumatic experience. For Thomas, however, the incident triggered a profound change. The mystery drew him out of his self-imposed isolation, first to help Rebecca piece together what had happened, then to reluctantly attend a small thank-you gathering organized by the Parker family. There, Thomas met Rebecca's grandmother, Eleanor Parker, a sharp-eyed woman in her 80s with a keen interest in local history. When Thomas mentioned his late wife's maiden name, Monroe, Eleanor startled visibly. "Marie Monroe?" "From Whitefish?" she asked. Thomas nodded, surprised. Eleanor explained that the Monroes and Parkers shared ancestors, distant cousins separated by generations but connected through the original settlers of the region. Without realizing it, Thomas had saved a member of his wife's extended family. The coincidences, or perhaps something more meaningful, didn't end there. As winter gave way to spring, Thomas found himself drawn back to Pinewood Springs with increasing frequency. Luna, Alaska seemed to belong to both households now, splitting her time between them. Rebecca's photographs of the local wildlife earned recognition in national publications, bringing attention to conservation efforts in the area, work that aligned perfectly with Thomas's role as a ranger. By summer, Thomas had taken a position that allowed him to remain in his cabin, but required regular interaction with the community. The walls he had built around himself didn't come down all at once, but brick by brick, they were dismantled. The townspeople of Pinewood Springs often retold the story, how a lost dog in a snowstorm had connected two strangers who turned out to be distant relatives. how a man who had appeared to guide a hiker to safety seemed to have been in two places at once, and how these seemingly random events had pulled a grieving man back into the world of the living. Some said it was just coincidence. Others suggested that Marie and Emily had somehow engineered the whole thing from beyond, sending Luna as their messenger. Thomas never publicly offered his opinion on these theories, but sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, he would look at Luna sleeping peacefully beside him and whisper his thanks to the universe for sending her to scratch at his door on that frigid winter night. In the forests of Montana, where wilderness and civilization exist in delicate balance, the story became something of a local legend. The tale of how a half-frozen dog and a chain of improbable events changed not just one life, but an entire community served as a reminder that even in our most isolated moments, we remain connected by invisible threads that weave through time, space, and even death itself. And in a small cabin at the edge of the forest, a man who once believed his capacity for joy had died alongside his family discovered that the heart, like nature itself, possesses a remarkable ability to regenerate after even the harshest of winters.